The day my daughter told me my old house embarrassed her, she didn't raise her voice. She simply glanced around the faded hallway where she'd taken her first steps and whispered, "Mom, this place makes people think we came from nothing." I smiled so she wouldn't see my heart breaking. 4 days later, a stranger in an expensive suit knocked on my door, looked at the same weathered porch Rachel had mocked, and calmly said, "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm prepared to offer you several $1,000,000 for this house." In that moment, I realized neither my daughter nor I truly knew what this old home was worth. If you've ever had someone make you feel ashamed of something you loved, I'd really like to hear your story in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If this story speaks to your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these journeys together. When people hear that someone offered millions of dollars for my house, they usually imagine a grand estate with marble floors, sweeping staircases, and manicured gardens stretching toward the horizon. I always smile when they picture something that never existed. My home wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared in glossy magazines or luxury real estate brochures. Its white paint had faded into soft shades of cream after decades beneath the North Carolina sun. The porch creaked beneath every visitor's footsteps. Some shutters leaned just enough to make strangers wonder whether they should be repaired. The flower beds were never perfectly symmetrical because my late husband Thomas always said flowers grew happier when they were allowed to choose their own direction. To me, every crooked board and every faded window held a memory. To Rachel, they had become imperfections. I suppose I should begin where my real story starts, not with the millionaire standing on my porch, but with the life that filled those walls long before anyone attached a dollar amount to them. I have lived in the same house for 44 years. Thomas brought me there only 3 weeks after our wedding. I remember pulling into the gravel driveway in his old pickup truck. The afternoon sunlight poured through the towering oak trees that lined both sides of the property, making the entire yard glow like something from an old painting. He reached over, squeezed my hand, and said with the biggest smile I'd ever seen, "Welcome home." At the time, I laughed. "This old place?" I asked. He nodded proudly. "The oldest Sullivan house still standing." I didn't understand what that meant then. Later, I learned that Thomas's grandfather had begun building the house more than 100 years earlier. Back then, families didn't simply hire contractors. They built with neighbors, cousins, brothers, and friends. Every beam had been lifted by familiar hands. Every nail had been driven by someone who expected the home to shelter future generations. Thomas loved telling those stories. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every anniversary, he somehow found another little piece of family history to share. Sometimes I teased him. "I've heard this story 10 times. He would grin. "Then you'll remember it the 11th. Looking back now, I'm grateful he never stopped repeating them. After Thomas passed away 8 years ago, silence settled into the house like an unexpected guest. The first few months were unbearable. For 36 years, I had never woken up alone. Suddenly, the coffee pot made enough for one. Only one towel disappeared from the bathroom rack each morning. Only one voice echoed through the hallway. I kept expecting to hear Thomas whistling while fixing something that didn't really need fixing. Sometimes I still do. People often ask whether living alone in such a large house feels lonely. The truthful answer is, sometimes. But loneliness isn't the same as emptiness. This house has never felt empty. Every room carries someone I loved. The kitchen still reminds me of Saturday mornings when Rachel was 6 years old, standing on a wooden stool beside me, while flour covered nearly every inch of the counter. She insisted she was helping bake cinnamon rolls. In reality, She mostly covered herself in flour. Thomas would walk in pretending to gasp. "My goodness," he'd say dramatically. "Looks like it snowed indoors." Rachel would laugh so hard she'd nearly fall off the stool. The dining room still reminds me of birthday dinners where balloons floated against the ceiling and homemade cakes leaned slightly because I never mastered perfectly straight frosting. The living room reminds me of rainy evenings when we played board games until someone accused Thomas of inventing new rules whenever he started losing. He always denied it. None of us ever believed him. Upstairs sits the bedroom Rachel grew up in. Even after she married and moved away, I never completely changed it. The wallpaper is newer now. The furniture has been replaced, but tucked inside the closet are tiny pencil marks measuring her height year after year. Age 6, age 8, age 10, age 13. Thomas refused to paint over them. "They're part of the house," he always said. He was right. When Rachel became successful, something slowly changed. Not overnight. People imagine relationships breaking with one terrible argument. Our distance arrived much more quietly. First, she became busy. Then she missed Sunday dinners. Later, birthdays became restaurant reservations instead of family meals. Holiday gatherings slowly moved to her beautiful suburban home outside Charlotte. She always had practical reasons. "The kids have more space here. My clients might stop by. It's closer for everyone." Each explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. Individually, none of them hurt very much. Together, they slowly erased traditions we'd built over decades. I tried not to complain. Parents aren't supposed to make their children feel guilty for building successful lives. Every time Rachel apologized for missing another visit, I'd tell her exactly the same thing. "I understand, sweetheart." Most of the time, I really did. She worked incredibly hard. She became one of the top real estate agents in her county. She and Jason built a beautiful life together. They drove nice cars. They traveled. Their daughter Olivia attended excellent schools. As her mother, I was proud, very proud. But pride has a strange way of living beside sadness. You can celebrate someone's success while quietly missing the person they used to be. The house became another casualty of that transformation. Rachel stopped calling it home. She called it the old place. At first, I barely noticed. Then she started suggesting little improvements. "You should replace those old windows. You'd love an open floor plan. Nobody wants separate dining rooms anymore. Maybe paint the brick." None of those suggestions were unreasonable. Homes change, families renovate, life moves forward. But every suggestion somehow erased another piece of Thomas. Another piece of us. One afternoon, about 3 years after Thomas died, Rachel stood in the living room studying the original oak staircase. "I never realized how dark this house is," she said. I looked around. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass window, scattering little patches of blue, red, and gold across the hardwood floor. To me, it looked beautiful. "I've always liked it," I answered. She shrugged. "I guess styles change." Maybe they do, but memories don't. Every Thursday afternoon, my closest friend, Carol Mitchell, walked across the street carrying either homemade cookies or fresh gossip. Sometimes both. She had lived next door for almost 40 years. She knew every chapter of our family's story. One afternoon, we sat together on my porch drinking iced tea while watching squirrels chase each other across the yard. Carol glanced toward my front door. "Rachel hasn't visited in a while." I smiled. "She's busy." Carol looked at me over the rim of her glass. "You always defend her." "She's my daughter." "I know." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Carol reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "You know, missing someone doesn't make you ungrateful for them." That sentence stayed with me because it was true. I didn't resent Rachel. I missed her. There is a difference. The hardest part wasn't that she visited less often. The hardest part was wondering whether she still saw this house the way Thomas and I always had. As a home, not a building, not an investment, not an outdated property waiting for renovations. Just home. I had no idea that before long, someone from outside our family would see far more in these old walls than anyone living inside them. And that discovery would change everything I believed about my home, my daughter, and the legacy Thomas had quietly protected for decades. The first time Rachel suggested I sell the house, she said it gently, almost carefully, as if she were testing how much truth I could handle at once. We were sitting at my kitchen table, the same one where she used to do her homework while I corrected spelling tests from my students. A soft breeze came through the open window, carrying the scent of jasmine from the side yard. I remember thinking it was a beautiful afternoon. Rachel didn't seem to notice. She was scrolling through something on her phone when she said almost casually, "Mom, have you ever thought about selling this place?" I looked up, surprised, but not alarmed. "Selling," I repeated. She nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "You could get something smaller, easier to maintain, closer to town. Maybe one of those communities with amenities." Amenities? It was such a strange word to hear in a conversation about home. I smiled politely. "I've lived here most of my life, sweetheart." "I know," she said quickly. "But that's exactly my point." I waited. She finally set her phone down and looked around the kitchen, her gaze lingering on the cabinets Thomas had refinished himself 20 years ago. "This house is a lot of what I asked." She hesitated just long enough for me to feel the shift in the room. Work, maintenance. "It's old, Mom." There it was again. Old, as if age were something to apologize for. Jason joined us a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee he'd picked up on the way. He greeted me warmly, kissed Rachel on the cheek, and slid into the chair beside her like he'd done it 1,000 times. Which, I suppose, he had. Rachel glanced at him, then back at me. "We were actually talking about this on the drive over," she said. Jason nodded, his tone calm and measured. "Have you looked at your property taxes lately?" I blinked. "That's an interesting way to start a conversation," I said lightly. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just mean, it's a valuable piece of land. Even if the house itself needs work, the location alone." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I had spent enough years as a librarian to understand what people meant even when they chose not to say it directly. The house might not matter. The land did. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to keep holding on to everything, Mom." Everything? Such a small word for something so large. I folded my hands in my lap, taking a slow breath. "I'm not holding on to everything," I said gently. "I'm living in my home." Jason cleared his throat. "We're just thinking about your future," he added. "And your comfort," Rachel quickly said. "This place has stairs, uneven floors, old wiring. I've managed just fine so far." I interrupted, still calm, but firmer now. Rachel sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Mom, I'm not saying you can't handle it. I'm saying you shouldn't have to." That sentence lingered in the air between us. It sounded caring. On the surface, it was caring, but something underneath it didn't sit quite right. Maybe it was the way the conversation kept circling back to numbers, costs, value, practicality. Very little of it had anything to do with how I felt. We moved on after that, at least outwardly. Rachel changed the subject to Olivia's school. Jason talked about work. I asked about their upcoming vacation. We all smiled. We all played our parts. But something had shifted. A few days later, Olivia came to visit on her own. That more than anything surprised me. Rachel usually managed Olivia's schedule carefully. Between school extracurriculars and social activities, there was rarely time for spontaneous visits. But that afternoon, I heard a car pull into the driveway and saw Olivia stepping out. Her long hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. I opened the door before she even reached the porch. "Well, this is a lovely surprise," I said. She grinned. "Hi, Grandma." She hugged me tightly, longer than teenagers usually hug anyone. "I had a free afternoon," she added. "Mom said it was okay." I stepped aside to let her in. "Well, I'm very glad you came." Olivia walked slowly through the house, her eyes taking in everything with a kind of quiet curiosity I hadn't seen in Rachel for years. She paused in the living room, running her fingers lightly over the edge of the wooden coffee table. "Is this really the same table Mom grew up with?" she asked. "It is," I said. She smiled. "That's kind of amazing. Such a simple phrase, but it warmed something inside me. We spent the afternoon together in the most ordinary way. We baked cookies. We looked through old photo albums. We sat on the porch and watched the sky begin to turn soft shades of orange and pink. At one point, Olivia found the old photo of Rachel covered in flour from that long-ago Saturday morning. She laughed. "Oh my gosh, that's Mom. The very same," I said. "She looks so happy." I nodded. She was. Olivia studied the picture for a moment longer. "Why doesn't she talk about this place much?" she asked. I chose my words carefully. "People grow up," I said. "Sometimes they leave parts of their past behind." Olivia frowned slightly. "I think that's sad." I looked at her. "So do I." Later, as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the yard, Olivia followed me upstairs. I showed her the small pencil marks inside the closet door, the ones Thomas had refused to paint over. She leaned in close, tracing one lightly with her fingertip. "This one says age 10, she read. "That's right. Mom was that short." I laughed. "Yes, believe it or not." Olivia smiled, but there was something thoughtful behind it. "She must have loved it here," she said quietly. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was complicated. "She did," I said finally. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then Olivia turned to me. "I like it here," she said. I felt my throat tighten slightly. "I'm very glad." When Rachel arrived later that evening to pick her up, she barely stepped inside. She stood in the doorway, car keys still in hand, glancing briefly around as if she were afraid someone might see her there. "Ready?" she asked Olivia. "Can I stay a little longer?" Olivia replied. "We're looking at old photos." Rachel hesitated. "Another time," she said. "We have dinner plans." Olivia looked disappointed but didn't argue. She grabbed her backpack and hugged me again. "Bye, Grandma." "Bye, sweetheart." As they drove away, I stood on the porch watching their car disappear down the road. The house felt quieter than usual that evening. Not empty, never empty, but quieter. And for the first time, a thought settled heavily in my chest. Maybe I wasn't the only one losing something. Maybe Rachel was too. She just didn't realize it yet. What I didn't realize was how much that loss would soon be measured not in memories, but in millions. The man who knocked on my door didn't look like someone who belonged in my quiet little neighborhood. That was my first thought. He stood straight, almost too straight, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it had never known a wrinkle. His shoes were polished to a shine that reflected the afternoon sunlight. Even the way he held himself calm, composed, observant, felt different from the usual visitors I received. For a brief moment, I wondered if he had the wrong house. I opened the door slowly. Yes, I asked. He offered a polite smile. Mrs. Meredith Sullivan. That's right. My name is Nathan Brooks, he said, extending his hand. I hope I'm not interrupting your day. I hesitated only a second before shaking his hand. You're not interrupting, I said. I just wasn't expecting anyone. That's fair, he replied. I'll be honest. I didn't call ahead. I was in the area and hoped I might have a chance to speak with you. There was something respectful about his tone. Not pushy, not rushed, just intentional. What is this about? I asked. He glanced past me just briefly into the house. It's about your home. I felt a small shift in my chest. My home, I repeated. Yes, ma'am. I stepped aside, not entirely sure why, and gestured for him to come in. Well, you'd better explain that, I said. He entered slowly, as though he understood he was stepping into something meaningful. The moment he crossed the threshold, his expression changed. It wasn't dramatic. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. His eyes moved, noticed it, but I did. His eyes moved carefully across the room, the staircase, the molding along the ceiling, the way the light filtered through the stained glass window near the landing. He didn't look at my house the way Rachel did. He didn't see flaws first. He saw, carefully across the room, the staircase, the molding along the ceiling, the way the light filtered through the stained glass window near the landing. He didn't look at my house the way Rachel did. He didn't see flaws first. He saw details. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the living room. Of course. He walked in slowly, almost reverently, as if he were afraid to disturb something invisible in the air. I followed him, watching as he ran his gaze along the edges of the room. Finally, he stopped near the base of the staircase. This is original, he said quietly. I blinked. I'm sorry, the woodwork, he clarified, gently touching the banister. It hasn't been replaced. No, I said. My husband always insisted on keeping things as they were. Nathan nodded, almost to himself. That's remarkable. I wasn't sure what to make of that. It's just an old house, I said. He turned to look at me then. No, Mrs. Sullivan, he said calmly. It's not. There was no arrogance in his voice, just certainty. That unsettled me more than anything else. What exactly do you mean? I asked. He took a slow breath, as though choosing his words carefully. I specialize in historic properties, he said, particularly homes that have been preserved in their original form. I crossed my arms lightly. There are plenty of old houses in this area. Yes, he agreed, but not like this one. He gestured toward the ceiling. May I ask, has any major renovation been done here? Structural changes, modern redesigns? No, I said. Repairs, yes, but Thomas never wanted to change the structure. Nathan smiled faintly. I suspected as much. He walked toward the window, studying the stained glass more closely. This is handcrafted, he murmured. Early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. I felt a small flicker of confusion. You can tell that just by looking. He chuckled softly. I've spent the last 25 years looking at homes like this. He turned back to me. Mrs. Sullivan, how much do you know about the origins of this house? I hesitated. My husband's grandfather built it, I said. That's about as much as I know. Nathan nodded slowly. That's consistent with what I found. What you found? I repeated. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. I've been researching properties in this region for the past year. That's consistent with what I found. What you found? I repeated. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. I've been researching properties in this region for the past year, he explained. specifically homes connected to a particular architectural style that was never widely documented. He opened the folder and showed me a few printed pages, old photographs, sketches, notes I didn't fully understand. I came across references to a builder, possibly an architect who worked in this area over 100 years ago, he continued. Very few of his structures still exist. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And you think this is one of them? I asked. I don't think he said. I'm almost certain. The room felt suddenly very quiet. That doesn't make sense, I said. No one has ever mentioned anything like that before. That's not unusual, Nathan replied. Many historically significant homes go unnoticed for decades, especially when they remain in private hands. I shook my head slightly. But why this one? He gestured around us. Because it hasn't been changed, he said simply. Most homes of this age have been remodeled, modernized, altered, stripped of their original character. This one hasn't. I thought about all the times Thomas had refused to replace something. The cabinets, the windows, the floors. At the time, I'd thought he was just being stubborn. Now I wasn't so sure. Nathan closed the folder. With your permission, he said, I'd like to bring in a small team to examine the property more thoroughly. Historians, preservation specialists, people who can confirm what I believe this house is. And what exactly do you believe it is? I asked. He held my gaze for a moment. A rare surviving example of early regional craftsmanship, he said. Possibly one of the last of its kind. I let out a slow breath. That's a very big claim. Yes, Mom, he said. It is. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then he said something that made my heart skip. If my assessment is correct, this property could be worth significantly more than you might expect. I almost laughed. More than I expect, I repeated. I wasn't expecting anything. He gave a small, respectful nod. That's often the case. I studied his face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of trick. But there was none. Just calm confidence. And if you're wrong, I asked, then you've lost nothing but a little time, he said. And I'll apologize for the inconvenience. I considered that time I had. What I didn't have was certainty. Finally, I nodded. All right, I said. You can bring your team. Nathan's expression softened slightly as if he had expected resistance. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. He gathered his things and moved toward the door. Before he left, he paused. There's one more thing, he said. Yes, if everything checks out, he added carefully, I would be very interested in making you an offer for the property. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. What kind of offer? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to make me pay attention. The kind that might change your life, he said. Then he stepped outside. And just like that, he was gone. I stood in the doorway for a long time after he left, staring out at the quiet road. The same road I had watched for decades. Nothing about it looked different, and yet everything felt like it had shifted. For years, I had believed I understood exactly what my home was. A place filled with memories, a place built by family, a place that belonged to us, and only to us. Now, for the first time, I wondered if there was something hidden in these walls that even I had never seen. And if there was, why had Thomas never told me Nathan returned 3 days later? This time, he didn't come alone. I remember standing at my front window early that morning, watching as 2 cars pulled slowly into the driveway. The gravel crunched beneath their tires in that familiar way, but the sound felt different, heavier somehow, as though it carried more meaning than it ever had before. 4 people stepped out. Nathan, of course. Then a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, a younger man carrying a leather satchel. a younger man carrying a leather satchel, and another gentleman who immediately began studying the exterior of the house before even approaching the door. I took a breath and opened it before they could knock. "Good morning," and another gentleman who immediately began studying the exterior of the house before even approaching the door. I took a breath and opened it before they could knock. "Good morning," Nathan said with a warm, respectful smile. "Thank you again for allowing us to come." "Good morning," I replied. "You brought quite a team." He gave a small nod. "These are preservation specialists. I promise we'll be as respectful of your home as possible." I stepped aside. "Please come in." The moment they entered, the energy shifted again, but in a different way than before. Where Nathan had been quietly observant, his colleagues were focused, intent. The silver-haired woman introduced herself as Dr. Elaine Porter, a historian specializing in early American domestic architecture. The younger man was named Caleb, an archivist, and the older gentleman outside eventually joined us, introducing himself as Walter Green, a structural preservation expert. They didn't waste time. Within minutes, they had spread out across the house, each drawn to different details, as if following invisible threads. Dr. Porter moved straight to the staircase, her fingers hovering just above the wood, not quite touching it. "Incredible," she murmured. Walter crouched near the baseboards, examining the joinery where the wood met the floor. "Hand cut," he said. "No machine work here." Caleb opened his satchel and began carefully photographing everything: windows, corners, hinges, even the patterns in the floorboards. I stood in the middle of it all, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Nathan remained beside me. "You're doing all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. He nodded, understanding. "That's completely fair." We spent the next several hours moving from room to room. Or rather, Nathan remained beside me. "You're doing all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. He nodded, understanding. "That's completely fair." We spent the next several hours moving from room to room. Or rather, they moved and I followed. In the dining room, Dr. Porter stopped in front of the fireplace, studying the carved wooden mantel. "Do you know who made this?" she asked. "My husband always said his grandfather built most of it himself," I replied. She smiled faintly. "That aligns with what we're seeing." In the kitchen, Walter examined the original beams hidden just beneath the ceiling. "These haven't been replaced," he said, almost surprised. "Most homeowners would have modernized by now." I felt a small, unexpected sense of pride. "He didn't believe in changing things that didn't need changing," I said. Walter nodded approvingly. "A rare mindset." Upstairs, Caleb paused in Rachel's old bedroom, carefully photographing the closet door where the pencil marks still remained. "These dates," he said. "They're wonderful." I laughed softly. "They're not exactly historical artifacts." He looked at me with genuine sincerity. "Actually, they are," he said. That caught me off guard. "For your family," he clarified. "And in homes like this, personal history often matters just as much as architectural history." I had never thought of it that way. To me, those marks had always been something simple. Proof that time had passed. Proof that a little girl had grown up. Now suddenly, they felt like something more. By early afternoon, the team gathered back in the living room. Papers had been spread across the coffee table. Photographs, notes, sketches, pieces of my home reduced to documentation. I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap. "Well?" I asked. There was a brief moment of silence. Then Dr. Porter spoke. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said gently, "your home is extraordinary." The word lingered. Extraordinary. Not old, not outdated. Extraordinary. "In what way?" I asked quietly. She glanced at Nathan, then back at me. We believe this house was built or at least designed by a regional craftsman whose work has largely disappeared over time, she explained. There are only a handful of documented structures attributed to him, and most have been heavily altered or destroyed. My heart began to beat a little faster. And this one, I asked. She smiled. This one appears to be remarkably intact. Nathan stepped forward slightly. That's why it's so significant, he added. It's not just old, it's preserved. Walter nodded in agreement. The structural integrity is impressive, he said. Original materials, original methods. It's rare to see this level of preservation in a privately owned home. I looked around the room. The same walls, the same furniture, the same soft creak in the floor beneath my feet. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. How certain are you? I asked. Dr. Porter met my gaze. Confident enough to say this property has substantial historical value, she said. Potentially even regional or national significance depending on further verification. I felt a strange mixture of emotions rising in my chest. Pride, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. Nathan answered this time. It means, he said carefully, that your home is worth considerably more than a typical property in this area. I let out a small breath. How much more, I asked. He hesitated. Just for a moment. Then he said the words that would change everything. Several $million. The room fell completely silent. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. I'm sorry. I said, did you say millions? Yes, ma'am. I shook my head slowly. That doesn't make sense. It's just a house. Nathan didn't argue. I understand why it feels that way, he said. But value isn't always about appearance. Sometimes it's about rarity, history, preservation. I looked down at my hands. The same hands that had baked cookies in this kitchen, folded laundry in this house, held my daughter when she cried as a child. Now suddenly, those hands were being told they were holding something worth millions. It didn't feel real. Thomas knew, I said softly, almost to myself. Nathan looked at me. What do you mean? I swallowed. He always insisted on keeping everything original, I explained. Even when it would have been easier to replace things. Dr. Porter nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense, she said. Whether he understood the full historical significance or not, he clearly recognized the value of preservation. I felt my throat tighten slightly. He never told me I whispered. Nathan's voice softened. Some people protect things quietly, he said. Not for recognition, but because they believe it matters. I closed my eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like Thomas. When I opened them again, the room felt different, heavier, fuller, not just with people, but with meaning. Nathan gathered the papers on the table and placed them neatly back into his folder. I'd like to make you a formal offer, he said. The words landed slowly, carefully, as if he understood their weight. I looked at him, my mind still trying to catch up with everything I had just heard. An offer, I repeated. Yes, ma'am. I hesitated. What kind of offer? He met my gaze directly. The kind that reflects the true value of this home, he said. I didn't answer right away, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I knew what that value truly was. News travels faster than you expect in a small town. I suppose I should have known that. By the next morning, Carol was already standing on my porch, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. She didn't knock the way most people do. Carol had her own way of knocking 3 quick taps a pause, then 1 louder knock, as if to say, "I know you're in there. Meredith, don't pretend you're not." I opened the door with a small smile. "Well," I said, "this looks serious." She walked in without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning my face. "What happened yesterday?" she asked immediately. I blinked. "That didn't take long." She crossed her arms. "Half the town saw those cars parked outside your house," she said. "And Mrs. Jenkins swears she saw a man photographing your windows like they were in a museum." I let out a small breath. "That's not far from the truth." Carol's eyes widened. "Oh, don't tell me they think the house might be historically significant," I said. She stared at me for a moment. Then she sat down very slowly at the kitchen table. "Well," she said, "I always knew you had good taste." I laughed softly. "I don't think it was my taste, Carol." She tilted her head. "Thomas?" I nodded. "He kept everything the way it was, even when it didn't make sense at the time." Carol smiled faintly. That man always knew more than he said. I looked down at my hands. "They think it could be worth millions." The word felt strange coming out of my mouth. "Millions?" Carol didn't react immediately. She just watched me. Then she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, "that certainly explains the photographer." We sat there for a moment in silence. Then she leaned forward slightly. "And how do you feel about that?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet." That was the honest answer. Because I didn't. On one hand, it felt like something extraordinary had been discovered, something Thomas had quietly protected all those years. On the other hand, it felt like strangers were suddenly assigning a price to something I had never considered selling. Carol studied me carefully. "Just don't let anyone rush you," she said. "People get different when money gets involved." I nodded. I've already started to notice that. I didn't have to wait long to see exactly what she meant. Rachel called me that afternoon. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how quickly she got to the point. "Mom, is it true?" she asked. I held the phone a little tighter. "What did you hear? That someone came to your house? That they think it's worth a lot of money?" There was no hesitation in her voice, no gentle approach, just direct, focused curiosity. "Yes," I said. "They brought in specialists yesterday," and she pressed. "They believe it has historical significance." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Oh my God," Rachel said. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. "That's incredible," she continued quickly. "Do you know what this means?" "I'm starting to," I replied. "You could sell it," she said. The words came so fast, so naturally, it caught me off guard. "Rachel?" "No, listen," she interrupted. "If it's really worth millions, Mom, that changes everything. Everything." There it was again. That word. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the familiar kitchen walls. "What exactly does it change?" I asked quietly. "It changes your future," she said. "You wouldn't have to worry about anything. You could move somewhere safer, more comfortable. We could invest the money. I noticed that word immediately. "We." "Well, I mean for the family," she said quickly. "For you, for Olivia." "And for you and Jason?" I asked gently. There was a brief pause. "That's not what I meant," she said, but it sounded exactly like what she meant. I didn't argue. "Not yet. I haven't made any decisions," I said instead. "Well, you should start thinking about it," Rachel replied. Opportunities like this don't come around twice. I closed my eyes for a moment. Rachel, I said softly, this house is more than an opportunity. She sighed. I know that, Mom, but it's also an asset. Asset. The word landed harder than she probably intended. I need some time, I said. Okay, she replied, though she didn't sound entirely satisfied. But don't wait too long. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Later that week, Rachel came to visit. Not just for a quick stop, not standing in the doorway. She came inside, fully. She brought groceries, fresh flowers, even a new set of dish towels she insisted would brighten up the kitchen. It felt different, too different. We sat together in the living room, the same room she had once called embarrassing. Now she looked around with a new kind of attention. This place really does have character. We sat together in the living room, the same room she had once called embarrassing. Now she looked around with a new kind of attention. This place really does have character, she said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. That's not the word you used last week. She smiled just a little too quickly. Well, I didn't realize what it was then. There it was. The shift. Not in the house, but in how she saw it. Jason came by later that afternoon. He shook my hand warmly, asked about my health, complimented the house in a way he never had before. It's a beautiful property, he said. Property. Another word I hadn't heard from him before. We sat at the kitchen table, just like before. But this time, the conversation felt calculated. So, Jason began, casually. Have you given any thought to what you might do? I looked at him. I've had a few thoughts. He nodded. Good, because if you decide to sell, it would be wise to plan ahead. Tax implications, investment strategies. I haven't decided to sell. I interrupted gently. He smiled. Of course. I'm just saying when you do, when. Not if. Rachel leaned forward slightly. We just want to help you make the best decision, Mom. I studied her face. Her expression was warm, concerned, but beneath it I saw something else. Expectation. And for the first time, I realized something that made my chest tighten. Before Nathan knocked on my door, this house had embarrassed her. Now it had value, and suddenly it mattered again. I glanced around the room, the same room filled with memories that had once been invisible to her. Nothing about it had changed, except the number attached to it. And that was when I understood what Carol had meant. People don't always change. Sometimes. Money simply reveals who they've been all along. Nathan returned the following week. This time, there were no specialists, no cameras, no quiet murmurs of admiration echoing through the house. It was just him and a leather folder that looked heavier than the one he had carried before. I had spent the days leading up to his visit in a strange state of stillness. Not quite calm. Not quite anxious, just suspended. Every room I walked through felt different now. Not because anything had changed, but because I knew something I hadn't known before. I found myself noticing details, the way Nathan had the curve of the staircase, the way the afternoon light caught the glass in the windows, the small imperfections that had once felt ordinary, but now seemed intentional. I wondered more than once if Thomas had walked through these same rooms with that same awareness. And if he had, why hadn't he ever said anything? When Nathan knocked, I was already standing near the door. Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan, he said as I opened it. Good morning, Nathan, I replied. There was something about the way he held himself that day, more formal, more deliberate. May I come in? He asked. Of course. We moved into the living room and I gestured for him to sit. Instead, he remained standing for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. "I won't take too much of your time," he said. "I know this is a lot to process." I nodded. "That's an understatement." He gave a small, understanding smile, then finally took a seat across from me. He placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "This contains a formal offer," he said. There it was, the moment Rachel had been waiting for. The moment Jason had already started planning for. The moment I hadn't quite prepared myself to face. "I'd like you to hear me out before you look at the numbers," Nathan continued. "Because this isn't just a transaction. For you or for me." I leaned back slightly. "I'm listening." He opened the folder, but instead of turning it toward me, he rested his hands lightly on top of it. "I've spent most of my career acquiring and preserving properties like this," he said. "Not to tear them down, not to modernize them beyond recognition, but to protect them." I studied his face. "You're not a developer," I said. He shook his head. "No, I work with Preservation Trust's historical foundations, sometimes private collectors who understand the responsibility that comes with ownership." Responsibility. That word felt heavier than value. "What would happen to the house if I sold it to you?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "It would be preserved," he said. "Carefully, respectfully. We would document every detail, restore only what is necessary, and restore only what is necessary, and ensure its history remains intact." I felt a small sense of relief at that. "And if I didn't sell?" I asked. He met my gaze calmly. "Then it would remain exactly where it belongs, ensure its history remains intact." I felt a small sense of relief at that. "And if I didn't sell?" I asked. He met my gaze calmly. "Then it would remain exactly where it belongs," he said. "With you." There was no pressure in his voice, no urgency, just honesty. That mattered more than I expected. Finally, he turned the folder toward me and opened it. The number sat there on the page, clear, undeniable, and far larger than anything I had ever imagined being associated with my life. For a moment, I couldn't even fully comprehend it. I blinked once, twice. "This is..." I began, then stopped. "Yes," Nathan said quietly. "It is." I let out a slow breath. I don't even know what to say. "You don't have to say anything today," he replied. "In fact, I'd prefer that you didn't." That surprised me. "Most people would be trying to close the deal right now," I said. He smiled faintly. "I'm not most people. That much I already knew." I closed the folder gently, my hands steady despite the storm of thoughts in my mind. "This is a lot of money," I said. "Yes, ma'am. It could change everything. It could." He agreed. I looked up at him. "And yet you're telling me not to decide quickly." He nodded. "Because decisions made too quickly, especially ones involving things we care about, often lead to regret." I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I asked the question that had been quietly forming in my mind since the day he first knocked on my door. "Why this house?" I asked. "Out of all the properties you've seen, why this one?" Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room, the same way he had the first time he entered. "Because it's still alive," he said finally. I frowned slightly. "Alive?" "Yes," he said. "Most historic homes lose something over time. They become staged, preserved, yes, but disconnected from the people who lived in them." He gestured gently toward the bookshelf, the worn armchair near the window, the small imperfections that told the story of daily life. This house hasn't lost that, he continued. It still feels like a home, not a museum. I felt something shift inside me. And you want to change that? I asked. He shook his head. No, I want to protect it. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he added something that I didn't expect, but I also understand that it may not be mine to protect. I looked at him. What do you mean? He said carefully that some things don't belong in the hands of investors or institutions, no matter how well-intentioned they are. That was the first time I truly saw him, not just as a buyer, but as someone who understood the weight of what he was asking. Before I could respond, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Nathan glanced toward the window. Are you expecting someone? He asked. I stood slowly, already knowing the answer. No, I said, but I had a feeling. I walked to the door and opened it. Rachel stood there, her expression bright, almost eager. Mom, she said, stepping inside before I could say anything. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Nathan. Oh, she said. I turned back towards the living room. Rachel, this is Nathan Brooks. Her eyes flicked to the folder on the table. Recognition flashed across her face almost instantly. You brought the offer, she said. Nathan stood politely. Yes, ma'am. Rachel didn't even try to hide her excitement. Well, she asked, turning to me. What did he say? I hesitated, because suddenly this moment didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt crowded, heavy with expectation. It's generous, I said carefully. Rachel stepped closer to the table, her eyes already scanning the folder. Can I see? She asked. I glanced at Nathan. He gave a small nod. Rachel opened the folder, and for a brief moment, she forgot everything else. Her breath caught. Oh my God, she whispered. Then she looked up at me, her expression filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not embarrassment, not distance, but something sharper. Mom, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You have to accept this. There it was. Not consider, not think about it. Have to. I felt my chest tighten, and for the first time I realized that this decision wasn't just about a house. It was about everything that house represented, and everyone who suddenly wanted a piece of it. That night, after Rachel and Jason left the house, felt heavier than it ever had before. Not quieter, not emptier. Heavier, as if every wall, every beam, every creaking floorboard carried the weight of a question I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I walked slowly through the house room by room, just as I had done 1,000 times before. But this time, I wasn't just remembering. I was searching for something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was an answer. Maybe it was Thomas. I ended up upstairs, standing in the hallway outside our old bedroom. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. 8 years. It had been 8 years since I lost him, and somehow I still expected to hear his voice when the house grew too quiet. You always overthink things, Meredith. I smiled faintly at the thought. Then I stepped inside. The room hadn't changed much. I had kept it that way on purpose. His side of the closet still held a few jackets I couldn't bring myself to donate. The dresser still carried the faint scent of the cologne he used every Sunday morning. Even the small scratch on the nightstand, the one he insisted he hadn't caused, remained exactly where it had always been. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath. What would you do? I whispered into the empty room. Of course, there was no answer. But as I sat there, My eyes drifted towards something I hadn't noticed in years. The old floorboard near the corner of the room. It had always been slightly loose. Thomas used to joke about it. One day, "I'll fix that," he'd say. He never did. I don't know what made me walk over to it that night. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was something deeper than that. I knelt down slowly and pressed my hand against the wood. It shifted slightly beneath my fingers, just as it always had. For a moment, I hesitated. Then gently, I lifted it. What I found underneath made my breath catch. A small bundle, wrapped in old cloth, carefully tucked away as if someone had placed it there with intention, never expecting it to be found by accident. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped it. Inside were several notebooks and a stack of sealed letters, all addressed in Thomas's handwriting. My heart began to race. I picked up the top letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but his writing was still clear. "Meredith," it began. I felt my throat tighten. He had written this to me. I opened it carefully and began to read. "If you're reading this, it means you finally found the one thing I never fixed." A soft, unexpected laugh escaped me. Even now he was teasing. I suppose I should explain why I left it that way. I swallowed my eyes, moving quickly across the page. This house is more than wood and nails. It carries every story that came before us. My grandfather understood that. I tried to understand it too. My chest tightened. I don't know if anyone else will see what I see in these walls. Maybe they won't. Maybe one day someone will try to put a price on it. I froze. A price? He had written that years ago. If that day comes, I hope you remember something simple. The value of a home is not measured by what someone is willing to pay for it, but by what it has given to the people who lived inside it. Tears blurred my vision. Money can change a life, Meredith, but it cannot replace a lifetime. I pressed the letter gently against my chest, closing my eyes for a moment. He knew. He knew this day might come, and he had left this for me. Not to tell me what to do, but to remind me what mattered. I reached for one of the notebooks next. Inside, I found years of his handwriting notes, thoughts, observations about the house, details about repairs he had made, reasons he had refused certain renovations, even small sketches of parts of the home labeled carefully as if he were documenting something important. On one page, I found a line that made me stop. Preservation isn't about the past. It's about protecting something meaningful for the future. I sat there on the floor for what felt like hours, reading through his words. Each page felt like a conversation I had missed. Each sentence felt like a piece of him returning. By the time I finished, the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear. Not simple, but clear. I carefully wrapped the letters and notebooks again, but this time, I didn't put them back under the floorboard. I carried them downstairs with me. The next morning, Rachel called again. Her voice was different this time, more urgent. "Mom, have you thought about it?" she asked. I stood by the kitchen window watching the sunlight stretch across the yard. "I have," I said, and she pressed. I took a slow breath. "I'm still thinking," she sighed. "Mom, what is there to think about? It's millions of dollars." I closed my eyes briefly. "It's also my home." "I know that," she said quickly. "But you can have a new home. A better one." Better. That word again. I opened my eyes. Better in what way, I asked. She hesitated. Well, newer, easier, more suitable. For who? I asked gently. For you, she said, and for all of us. I thought about Thomas's letter, about his words, about the way he had understood something I was only just beginning to see clearly. Rachel, I said softly, when was the last time you came here just because you wanted to be here? There was silence on the line. That's not fair, she said finally. I'm not trying to be unfair, I replied. I'm trying to understand. She exhaled sharply. I'm trying to help you make the right decision. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I know you are, I said. But for the first time, I'm not trying to be unfair, I replied. I'm trying to understand. She exhaled sharply. I'm trying to help you make the right decision. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I know you are, I said. But for the first time, I wasn't sure we meant the same thing by right. After we hung up, I walked into the living room and looked around. The same furniture, the same light, the same quiet sense of presence that had always made this house feel like something more than just a place to live. And for the first time since Nathan made his offer, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt grounded. Because now, I wasn't just deciding between keeping a house or selling it. I was deciding what kind of legacy I wanted to protect, and whether I was strong enough to choose it. Rachel didn't wait long after that day. In fact, I don't think she slept on it at all. The very next morning, she showed up again, this time with Jason, and neither of them bothered with small talk. I had just finished pouring my coffee when I heard their car pull into the driveway. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't hurry to greet them the way I normally would. Instead, I stood there for a moment, steadying myself. Because I already knew this wasn't a visit. It was a conversation, and probably not a gentle one. When I opened the door, Rachel walked in first, her expression determined. Mom, she said we need to talk. Jason followed behind her, quieter, but just as focused. I stepped aside and let them in. I assumed as much, I replied. We moved into the living room, the same room that had held birthday parties, Christmas mornings, quiet evenings with Thomas. Now it felt like a negotiation space. Rachel didn't sit right away. She paced once, then turned to face me. I've been thinking about the offer, she began. I have too, I said calmly. Then you understand, she continued, her voice tightening slightly, that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I gestured toward the chairs. Let's sit, I said. Reluctantly, she did. Jason sat beside her, folding his hands together, like he was preparing for a business meeting. I'm listening, I added. Rachel leaned forward. Mom, you're sitting on millions of dollars, she said. Do you realize how rare that is? Most people never get a chance like this. I realize that, I said. Then why are you hesitating? She asked, frustration creeping into her voice. I met her gaze. Because it's not just money, she exhaled sharply. Everything is about money at some point. That sentence hung in the air. Jason spoke up, then his tone calmer. Rachel doesn't mean that in a negative way, he said. She's just trying to look at the practical side. I nodded. I understand the practical side. Then you know this makes sense, Rachel pressed. You could move somewhere safer, somewhere easier. No stairs, no maintenance. I've heard this before, I interrupted gently. She paused. Then her expression shifted slightly. Okay, she said. Let's be honest. There it was, the moment the conversation changed. This house isn't practical for you anymore, she continued. It's outdated. It's too much work. And now it has value, real value. Why hold on to it? I took a slow breath. Because it's my home. She shook her head. It's a house, Mom. No, I said quietly. It's not. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You're being emotional. Yes, I said simply. I am. She let out a frustrated laugh. That's exactly the problem. Jason shifted uncomfortably beside her, but he didn't interrupt. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Rachel, I said, when did emotions become a problem? When they get in the way of making the right decision? She replied immediately. And what is the right decision? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Selling the house. There was no room for doubt in her voice. No room for discussion. Just certainty. I studied her for a long moment. Do you remember the kitchen table? I asked suddenly. She blinked, caught off guard. What? The kitchen table? I repeated. The one you used to sit at when you were little. The one where you used to do your homework? Her expression softened slightly. Of course I remember it. Do you remember the flower? I asked. The flower. When you tried to help me bake and ended up covering yourself and the entire kitchen in it. A faint smile flickered across her face despite herself. Yeah, she said quietly. I remember that. I nodded. That happened in this house. Her smile faded. Mom, and the pencil marks in your closet. I continued. Every birthday, every inch you grew, your father refused to paint over them. She looked away. I know. That happened in this house too. She shifted in her seat. I'm not saying those things don't matter, but you are, I said gently. No, I'm not, she insisted. I'm just saying they don't matter more than your future. I leaned forward slightly. And what do you think my future looks like? I asked. She hesitated. Comfortable, she said finally. Secure, easy. I nodded slowly. And what does that have to do with where I live? It has everything to do with it, she said. You could have a better life. There it was again. Better. I felt a small, steady calm settle over me. Better isn't always what you think it is, I said. Rachel's patience finally snapped. Mom, you're being stubborn, she said. This isn't about memories anymore. This is about reality. I held her gaze. No, I said quietly. This is about both. Jason cleared his throat. Maybe we should approach this differently, he said. No one is saying you have to sell immediately, but you should at least consider what this means long term. I am considering it, I replied. Then consider this, Rachel said quickly. What happens when you can't take care of this place anymore? What happens when something breaks, when you get older? Her words weren't cruel, but they were sharp, practical, focused on a future she believed she understood. I reached beside me and picked up the folded letter from Thomas, the one I had kept close since the night I found it. I found something yesterday, I said. Rachel frowned slightly. What is that? A letter, I replied. From who? I looked down at it briefly, then back at her. From your father? The room went still. Rachel's expression changed instantly. What? She whispered. I unfolded the letter carefully. He wrote it years ago, I said, and he left it hidden in the house. Jason leaned forward slightly. What does it say? I took a breath. Then I read the line that had stayed with me more than anything else. The value of a home is not measured by what someone is willing to pay for it, but by what it has given to the people who lived inside it. Silence filled the room. Rachel stared at me, her eyes searching my face. That's just sentiment, she said finally. I shook my head. No, I said. It's perspective. She leaned back, shaking her head in disbelief. So, you're going to ignore millions of dollars because of a letter I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply answered. I'm not ignoring anything I said. I'm understanding it. Rachel stood abruptly. I don't understand you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I really don't. I looked at her. I know. She grabbed her bag. Come on, Jason, she said. He hesitated for a moment, then stood as well. Before leaving, he looked at me. Just think about it, he said quietly. I will, I replied. Rachel didn't say anything else. She walked out the door without looking back. And just like that, the house fell silent again. But this time, the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt like the calm before something inevitable. Because I knew this conversation wasn't over. Not even close. For the first time since Nathan made his offer, I didn't call Rachel back. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I did something Rachel would never have expected. I asked for advice from people who had nothing to gain from my decision. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Dr. Elaine Porter, again this time, not in my living room, but in a quiet office filled with books, framed architectural drawings, and the faint smell of old paper. She had invited me there after I called Nathan and asked if I could speak with someone outside of the buying process. To his credit, he didn't hesitate. If you're going to make a decision like this, he had said, you deserve to understand every option. Now sitting across from Dr. Porter, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Clarity, or at least the beginning of it. I'm glad you came, she said warmly, folding her hands on the desk. I am too, I admitted. She studied me for a moment. You've had time to think, she said. I have, and I hesitated. I don't think I want to sell, I said finally. She nodded as if she had expected that answer. But I also don't know what happens if I don't, I added. That's a fair concern, she said. I leaned forward slightly. Everyone keeps talking about the money, I continued, but no one has really explained what it means to keep something like this. She smiled gently. That's because most people don't think in those terms, she said. They think in terms of ownership and profit, not preservation. Then help me understand preservation, I said. She reached for a folder on her desk, not unlike the one Nathan had brought, but this one felt different, less transactional, more intentional. There are options, she explained. You don't have to choose between selling the house entirely or managing everything on your own. I frowned slightly. What kind of options? Partnerships, she said. Preservation agreements, historical grants, even partial easements that protect the structure while allowing you to retain ownership. I blinked. That's possible. Very, she said. In fact, it's often the best solution for homes like yours. I sat back, absorbing that. So I wouldn't have to give it up? I asked. Not necessarily, she replied. It depends on what you want and what you're willing to commit to. I thought about Thomas's letter, about his words, about the quiet way he had protected this house without ever asking for recognition. What would I be committing to? I asked. Preservation takes effort, she said honestly. There are guidelines, inspections, sometimes restrictions on what changes can be made. But you would also receive support, financial, structural, historical. And the value, I asked. She tilted her head. What do you mean? The money, I said. If I don't sell, do I lose all of that? She smiled faintly. That depends on how you define. Lose, she said. I let out a small breath. That's not a simple answer. No, she agreed. It's not. We talked for nearly 2 hours. About the house. About its history. About what it could become, not as a transaction, but as a legacy. By the time I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt since this all began. Not certainty, but direction. Later that afternoon, Nathan came by again. This time, I invited him to sit on the porch. It felt more appropriate than the living room, less formal, more honest. We sat side by side, looking out at the yard where Rachel used to play, where Thomas used to stand with his hands on his hips surveying work he insisted didn't need to be done. I spoke with Dr. Porter, I said. Nathan nodded. I thought you might. She explained some options I didn't know existed. She's very good at that, he said. I turned to him. You knew, I said. Knew what? That I didn't have to sell to preserve the house. He didn't deny it. I suspected you might want to explore that path, he said. And you didn't push me toward it, I said. He smiled slightly. That wasn't my place. I studied him for a moment. Most people in your position would have tried to close the deal, I said. Most people would, he agreed. Why didn't you? He looked out at the yard for a moment before answering. Because I don't just buy houses, he said quietly. I protect them. I let that sink in. And if I choose not to sell, I asked. He turned back to me. Then it'll help you find a way to protect it yourself. That answer surprised me more than anything else he had said. You would do that, I asked. Yes, he said simply. Even if it means you don't get the house. He nodded. Especially then. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I left Dr. Porter's office. What if I could do both? I said. Nathan raised an eyebrow slightly. Both. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I left Dr. Porter's office. What if I could do both? I said. Nathan raised an eyebrow slightly. Both preserve the house and still secure my future, I explained. He considered that. There are ways, he said slowly, but they require careful planning. I'm willing to plan, I said. He smiled. I can see that. That evening, Rachel called again. This time, I answered. Mom, she said immediately. Have you made a decision? I walked slowly through the house as I spoke, my fingers brushing lightly against the walls, as if I were grounding myself in something real. I'm getting closer, I said. She sighed. Mom, please don't overcomplicate this. I stopped in the hallway, looking up at the staircase. I think I've been undercomplicating it, I said. What does that mean? It means this isn't just about selling a house, I replied. It's about deciding what this house means. She sounded frustrated. It means money, Mom. It means security. It also means history, I said, and family, and legacy. There was a pause. Then she said something that stung more than I expected. Legacy doesn't pay bills. I closed my eyes for a moment. No, I said quietly. But it builds something money can't. She didn't respond right away. Are you really going to turn down millions? She asked finally. I opened my eyes. I haven't turned down anything, I said. I'm finding a way to make the right decision. And what if your version of right cost you everything she asked? I looked around the house, at the walls, the floors, the memories that had shaped my life. Then I answered her. I think I already know what everything is, I said, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing it. Rachel didn't come back for 3 days. That alone told me everything I needed to know. When she was quiet, it wasn't because she had let something go. It was because she was building a stronger argument, and when she finally returned, she didn't come alone. This time, there was no pretending, no polite smiles, no softened tone. When I opened the door, Rachel stood there with Jason beside her, and something in her expression made my chest tighten before she even spoke. Mom, she said, we need to settle this. Settle. Not discuss. Not understand. Settle. I stepped aside and let them in. The house felt different that afternoon, not because of them, because of me. For the first time, I wasn't unsure. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't trying to catch up to everything happening around me. I was ready. We sat in the living room again, but this time I didn't feel like I was being pulled into something. I felt like I was holding my ground. Rachel didn't wait. I talked to a financial advisor, she said immediately. I nodded. I assumed you might. He ran the numbers. She continued. Even conservatively, this could set you up for the rest of your life in Olivia's. There it was again. The future. Always the future. And what about the present? I asked. She frowned slightly. What? What about right now? I said. What about what I have? Her expression hardened. Mom, this isn't about what you have. It's about what you could have. I held her gaze. I already have everything I need. She let out a frustrated breath. No, you don't, she said. You have an old house that needs constant maintenance and this old house raised you, I said quietly. Her voice sharpened. And I'm grateful for that, but that doesn't mean you have to stay stuck in it forever. Stuck. The word hit harder than she intended, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. Jason stepped in, then trying to soften things. No one is saying the house isn't meaningful, he said. But at some point, you have to separate emotion from logic. I turned to him. And who decides where that line is? I asked. He hesitated. Well, in situations like this, it's usually about long-term benefit. For who, I asked again. He didn't answer. Rachel stood abruptly. Why are you making this so difficult? She demanded. Do you know how many people would kill for an opportunity like this? I didn't raise my voice. I'm not those people. She stared at me, her eyes flashing with something deeper than frustration now. Fear. Mom, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You're going to regret this. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not defensiveness, clarity. No, I said softly. I think I would regret the opposite. She shook her head. You don't understand what you're giving up. I stood slowly. And you don't understand what you're asking me to give away. The room went silent. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel's voice broke just slightly. I spent my whole life trying to get away from this place, she said. There it was. Not anger, not greed, something deeper. I didn't want people to look at me and think I came from this. She continued gesturing vaguely around the room. I felt my chest tighten. This I repeated. She swallowed hard. A small town, an old house, a life that felt limited. I nodded slowly. And now, she hesitated. Now I realize it's worth something. I looked at her for a long moment. Was it not worth something before? I asked. She didn't answer, because she couldn't. Jason shifted beside her, his expression more serious now. Rachel worked very hard to build a different life, he said, one that gives her opportunities she didn't have growing up. I nodded. And I'm proud of her for that, I said. Rachel looked at me surprised. Then why are you fighting this? She asked. Because success doesn't mean we erase where we came from, I said. Her voice rose again. I'm not trying to erase anything. Aren't you? I asked gently. She froze. I didn't want to feel less than other people. She admitted, and suddenly, everything made sense. Not the money, not the pressure, her, all of it. You were never less than anyone, I said softly. That's easy for you to say, she replied. You didn't have to prove anything. I almost smiled. Oh, Rachel, I said, we all have to prove something. We just choose different things to prove. Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. I didn't want Olivia to feel embarrassed the way I did, she said. I stepped closer. And do you think she does? I asked. Rachel hesitated. I don't know. I nodded. I do. She looked up at me. She doesn't see this house as something to be ashamed of, I continued. She sees it as something to be proud of. Rachel's expression faltered. That's not what she told me, she said. That's because you never asked her the right questions, I replied. Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different, less like conflict, more like truth settling into place. Jason spoke quietly. Even if that's true, it doesn't change the financial reality. I turned to him. No, I said, but it changes the emotional one. Rachel wiped at her eyes, frustrated with herself. So, what are you saying? She asked. I took a slow breath. I'm saying I'm not selling the house, I said. The words landed firmly, clearly, no hesitation. Rachel stared at me. You're serious? Yes. Jason leaned back, exhaling slowly. Even with the offer, he asked. Even with the offer? Rachel shook her head in disbelief. I don't understand you, she said again. I smiled faintly. I think you're starting to. She didn't respond. Not right away. Because something had shifted. Not in me, in her. For the first time, she wasn't arguing. She was thinking. And that was something money could never force. The house felt different after that conversation. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something had shifted between us. Rachel didn't storm out that day. She didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice again. Instead, she left quietly. And that more than anything told me something inside her had cracked. Not broken, but cracked enough to let something new in. The next time I saw her, she wasn't alone. Olivia walked in first. Grandma, she called out, her voice bright in a way that immediately softened the tension I had been carrying all week. I smiled as I opened my arms. Well, this is exactly what I needed today, I said, hugging her tightly. Rachel followed behind her, quieter than usual. She didn't avoid eye contact, but she didn't meet it easily either. Hi, Mom, she said. Hi, sweetheart. There was no argument, no tension in the air, just something unspoken. I thought Olivia could spend the afternoon with you, Rachel said. If that's okay. Of course it's okay, I replied. Olivia was already halfway into the living room, her eyes lighting up the way they always did when she stepped into this house. "Can we look at the old photos again?" she asked. "We can do anything you'd like," I said. Rachel lingered near the doorway for a moment. "You'll pick her up later," she said. I nodded. "Take your time." She hesitated as if she wanted to say something more, but she didn't. She left, and for the first time in days, the house felt light again. Olivia spent the afternoon exactly the way I had hoped she would. Curious, present, connected. We started in the attic. I hadn't gone up there much since Thomas passed, but something about Olivia's excitement made it feel less like a place of forgotten things and more like a place waiting to be rediscovered. Dust floated softly through the air as we opened old boxes. "What's in here?" she asked, kneeling beside a worn wooden trunk. "Let's find out," I said. Inside were old photo albums, letters, and a few small keepsakes I hadn't seen in years. Olivia carefully picked up a photograph. "Is this Mom?" she asked. I leaned closer. It was Rachel, at about 8 years old, sitting on the front porch steps with a wide, carefree smile. "That's her," I said. "She looks so different," Olivia said. "How so?" "She looks happy in a different way," she replied. I smiled faintly. She was. Olivia studied the photo for a moment longer. "Why doesn't she talk about this place much?" she asked. I hesitated. Sometimes people think they have to leave parts of their past behind in order to move forward, I said. Olivia frowned slightly. "That doesn't make sense. It doesn't always." I agreed. We spent hours going through old things, not rushing, not organizing, just remembering. At one point, Olivia found a small box filled with handwritten recipes. "Did you write these?" she asked. "Some of them," I said. "But most are from your great-grandmother." Her eyes widened. "Really?" I nodded. "She passed them down to me, just like the house was passed down to your grandfather?" Olivia looked around the attic, her expression thoughtful. "So, this house has been in the family for a long time," she said. "Yes," I said. "Do you think it will stay in the family?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. I sat down slowly on an old wooden chair. "I don't know yet," I admitted. She nodded, accepting that answer in a way only someone her age could. "I hope it does," she said quietly. I felt something tighten in my chest. "Why?" I asked. She shrugged. "Because it feels important." Important. Not valuable, not impressive. Important. We went back downstairs later, carrying a few of the items we had found. Olivia insisted on cleaning the old photo frames and arranging them on the coffee table. "This one should go here," she said carefully, placing a picture of Rachel and Thomas together. "And this one, right next to it." I watched her as she worked. There was something so natural about it, so effortless. She wasn't trying to preserve history. She was simply honoring it. By the time Rachel returned that evening, the living room looked slightly different. Not cleaner, not more modern, just fuller, more alive. She stepped inside and stopped when she saw the photos. "What is all this?" she asked. Olivia beamed. "We went through the attic," she said. "Look, this is you." Rachel walked slowly toward the table. She picked up one of the photographs. I watched her face carefully as she looked at it. The shift was subtle, but it was there. "That was my 8th birthday," she said softly. "You remember?" Olivia asked. Rachel nodded. "Your grandfather made a cake that leaned to one side," she said, almost smiling. "And your grandma said it gave it character." I laughed quietly. "I stand by that." Rachel glanced at me. For a moment, we didn't say anything. Then Olivia spoke again. Mom, why don't we come here more often? She asked. Rachel hesitated. I don't know, she said. Olivia looked around the room. I like it here, she said simply. Rachel swallowed. I can see that. We sat together for a few minutes. No arguments, no pressure, just presence. Then Olivia said something that changed everything. Are you really going to sell the house? She asked. Rachel froze. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to Olivia. We're talking about it. No arguments, no pressure, just presence. Then Olivia said something that changed everything. Are you really going to sell the house? She asked. Rachel froze. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to Olivia. We're talking about it, she said carefully. Olivia frowned. But why? Rachel opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, because for the first time, she didn't have a simple answer. I didn't step in. I didn't rescue her. I let the silence sit there. Because sometimes silence teaches more than words. Olivia looked between us. I think it would be sad, she said quietly. Rachel looked down at the photograph in her hands. So do I. Because sometimes silence teaches more than words. Olivia looked between us. I think it would be sad, she said quietly. Rachel looked down at, she said quietly. Rachel looked down at the photograph in her hands. So do I, she whispered. And in that moment, I knew something had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for her to start seeing this house not as something to escape, the photograph in her hands. So do I, she whispered. And in that moment, I knew something had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for her to start seeing this house, not as something to escape, but as something she had once loved. And maybe something she could love again. Rachel didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. But this time, her absence didn't feel like distance. It felt like reflection. A week passed before I saw her again. This time, she didn't call ahead. She didn't bring Jason, and she didn't bring Olivia. When I opened the door, she stood there alone, holding something in her hands. A worn leather album. I recognized it immediately. Where did you find that? I asked softly. She hesitated. In the attic, she said. I stopped by when you were out yesterday. I stepped aside and let her in. That album hasn't been opened in years, I said. I know, she replied quietly. We walked into the living room together. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood near the coffee table, running her fingers over the edge of the album like she wasn't quite sure she had the right to open it. Can I? She asked. You don't have to ask, I said. She sat down slowly and opened it. Dust lifted slightly from the pages as she turned the first one. And just like that, time shifted. The first photograph was one I had seen 100 times. Rachel at 5 years old sitting on Thomas's shoulders, her arms stretched wide as if she could touch the sky. She stared at it for a long moment. I remember this day, she said softly. Do you? I asked. She nodded. It was the summer after kindergarten, she said. Dad said I was finally tall enough to see over the fence. I smiled faintly. You weren't, I said. But he lifted you anyway. She let out a small, quiet laugh. That sounds like him. She turned the page. Another photo, another memory. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family dinners. All of it captured in moments she hadn't thought about in years. I forgot how much time we spent here, she said. I didn't answer. Because this wasn't something she needed me to explain. It was something she needed to remember. She kept turning the pages, slower now, more carefully, as if each image carried more weight than the last. At one point, she stopped completely. Her hand froze on the page. I leaned slightly to see what she was looking at. It was a photograph of her at 13, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of books in front of her. Thomas stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, both of them smiling. "That was the night I told you I wanted to be successful," she said quietly. I nodded. "You said you didn't want to struggle the way we did." Her voice wavered slightly. "I said I didn't want to live like this forever." I met her gaze. "And I told you there was nothing wrong with wanting more." She swallowed. "You didn't say there was anything wrong with this either." "No," I said, "because there wasn't." She looked back at the photo. "But I acted like there was," she whispered. Silence filled the room. Heavy, but not painful. Honest. "I was embarrassed," she said finally. I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. "Not because of you," she added quickly, "or Dad, but everything else." She gestured vaguely. The house, the town, the way people looked at us when they knew we didn't have much. I nodded slowly. "You felt small." "Yes," she said, "and you thought success would make you feel bigger." She let out a shaky breath. "I thought it would fix everything." I leaned back slightly. "And did it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the album halfway and stared down at it. "For a while," she said, "it felt like it did. And now," her voice dropped to almost a whisper, "now I feel like I lost something along the way." I felt my chest tighten. "What did you lose?" I asked gently. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. "This," she said, gesturing to the house. "Us. The way things used to feel." I nodded. "You didn't lose it," I said. "You just stopped looking at it." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to look," she admitted, "because I thought if I did, I'd feel like I hadn't gone far enough." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "Rachel," I said softly, "you went exactly where you needed to go." She shook her head, "But I left everything behind to get there." "No," I said, "you carried it with you. You just forgot you had it." She wiped at her eyes, letting out a small broken laugh. "That sounds like something Dad would say." "It is," I said. She looked at me surprised. "I found something he left," I added. Her expression shifted instantly. "What?" "A letter," I said, "hidden in the house." She leaned forward. "What did it say?" I smiled faintly. It said more than I realized at first. I paused, then repeated the line that had changed everything for me. "The value of a home is not measured by what someone is willing to pay for it, but by what it has given to the people who lived inside it." Rachel closed her eyes. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then quietly she said, "I think I finally understand that." The words settled gently between us. Not dramatic, not loud, but real. "I've been pushing you to sell," she continued, "because I thought that was the smartest thing to do." I nodded. "I know. But I wasn't thinking about what it would take away," she said. "Only what it would give." I squeezed her hand gently. "That's a very human mistake." She looked at me again. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words were simple, but they carried years of distant misunderstanding and unspoken emotion. "I'm sorry I made you feel like this place didn't matter," she added, like it was something to be ashamed of. I felt my throat tighten. "You didn't make me feel that way," I said. "But I'm glad you don't feel that way anymore." She nodded slowly. "I don't," she said. "Not anymore." We sat there for a long time, not talking, just being. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like there was anything between us. No expectations, no pressure, just understanding. Finally, Rachel closed the album and looked around the room. "This house didn't embarrass me," she said quietly. "It reminded me of who I was before I became who I thought I needed to be." I smiled softly. "And who are you now?" She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Someone who finally knows the difference." And in that moment, I knew we had both found something far more valuable than anything Nathan could have written in that offer. The decision didn't come in a single moment. It didn't arrive with a sudden realization or a dramatic declaration. Instead, it settled quietly, like something that had always been there, waiting for me to finally see it clearly. A few days after Rachel and I talked, I asked her to come over again. This time, I invited Jason too. Not because I needed his opinion, but because I wanted everything said out in the open. No assumptions, no misunderstandings. When they arrived, I didn't take them into the living room. Instead, I led them to the porch. It felt right. That was where Thomas and I had spent countless evenings talking about everything and nothing. That was where decisions had always felt grounded. We sat together, the late afternoon sun stretching across the yard. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Rachel looked at me. "You've made a decision," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I have." Jason leaned forward slightly. "I think we all just want to understand," he said carefully. I smiled faintly. "That's fair." I took a slow breath. "I'm not selling the house," I said. Rachel didn't react the way she had before. No frustration, no argument, just a quiet nod. "I thought you might be interested in buying the house." It just a quiet nod. I thought you might say that, she replied. But I continued. That got both of their attention. I'm also not ignoring the reality of what this house represents financially. Jason raised an eyebrow slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been exploring other options," I said. Rachel leaned forward. "What kind of options?" I glanced out at the yard before answering. "Preservation partnerships," I said. "Historical agreements. Ways to protect the house while also creating some level of financial stability." Jason's expression shifted. "That's actually possible," he said slowly. "It is," I replied. "I spoke with Dr. Porter, and Nathan has been helping me understand how it could work." Rachel frowned slightly. "So, you're working with him?" "I am," I said. Jason nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. He knows that world." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "And what does that look like?" she asked. I turned to her. "It means the house would be partially protected under a preservation agreement," I explained. "Certain elements can't be changed. The structure, the design, the historical features, they stay intact." "And the financial part?" Jason asked. "There are grants," I said, "tax benefits, and potentially a limited partnership where part of the property's value is realized without selling the entire house." "There are grants," I said, "tax benefits, and potentially a limited partnership where part of the property's value is realized without selling the entire house." Rachel blinked. "So you wouldn't lose everything financially?" "No," I said, "but I wouldn't gain everything either." Jason nodded slowly. A middle ground. Yes, I said. Rachel leaned back in her chair, processing. That's actually a smart solution, she admitted. I smiled slightly. It's a thoughtful one. She looked at me, her expression softer now. And you're sure that's what you want? I didn't hesitate. Yes. There was a long pause. Then Rachel said something I didn't expect. I think that's the right decision. I looked at her, surprised. You do? She nodded. Yeah, she said. I do. Jason glanced at her. You're okay with that? He asked. She let out a small breath. I wasn't before, she admitted, but I think I understand now. She turned back to me. This house isn't just an asset, she said. It's something else. I smiled. Exactly. She shook her head slightly, almost laughing at herself. I can't believe I didn't see it sooner. You saw what you needed to see at the time, I said. She nodded. And now I see something different. We sat there for a while, letting the conversation settle. Then Jason spoke again. From a practical standpoint, he said, this is actually a strong position. You're preserving value while maintaining control. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like something you'd say to a client. He smiled. It is. Rachel laughed softly. Of course it is. The tension that had filled the past few weeks was gone. Not erased, but replaced. Replaced with something steadier, more honest. I do have one condition, I said. They both looked at me. What is it? Rachel asked. I met her gaze. This house stays part of the family, I said. She nodded immediately. It will. Not just in name, I added. In presence, in memory, in how it's treated. Her expression softened. I understand. I smiled. And Olivia gets to decide what it means to her. Rachel's eyes filled slightly at that. She already has, she said quietly. I nodded. I know. The sun dipped lower as we sat there, the light turning warm and golden. For the first time since this all began, everything felt aligned. Not perfect, but right. Before they left, Rachel stood on the porch for a moment looking out at the yard. You know, she said, I used to think leaving this place was the only way to become who I wanted to be. I stood beside her, and now, she smiled softly, now I think maybe I just needed to understand it better. I reached for her hand. That's all any of us can do. She squeezed my hand gently. Thank you for not giving up on me, she said. I shook my head. I never did. She looked at the house one more time before stepping off the porch. And this time, there was no hesitation in her eyes, only understanding, and maybe a quiet sense of coming home. It took a few months for everything to settle into place, not because the decision was unclear anymore, but because doing something right often takes longer than doing something fast. The preservation agreement wasn't simple. There were meetings, paperwork, inspections, conversations with people who spoke in terms I had never needed to understand before. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel overwhelmed by it. Because every step had purpose. Every signature meant something. And every decision felt aligned with something deeper than convenience. Nathan stood beside me through all of it, not as a buyer, but as something else entirely. A guide, a partner in preserving something neither of us wanted to see lost. You're doing exactly what this house needs, he told me one afternoon as we reviewed the final documents. I'm doing what we needed, I replied. He smiled. I think your husband would agree with you, I believed that. More than anything, when everything was finalized, the house was officially recognized as a protected historical property. Not a museum, not a monument, a living home. One that would remain part of our family while also becoming something larger than just us. Something that would outlive all of us. The first time we opened the house for a small community tour, I wasn't sure how I would feel. Strangers walking through rooms that had held so many private memories. It felt strange. At first. But then I saw Olivia. Standing near the staircase, her voice steady as she spoke to a small group of visitors. "This house has been in my family for over 100 years, she said proudly. My great-grandfather helped preserve it even when no one else understood why it mattered. I stood quietly in the corner, watching her. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't unsure. She belonged there. And this staircase, she continued gently placing her hand on the banister, is one of the original features. My grandma says it tells a story if you know how to listen. A woman in the group smiled. What kind of story, she asked. Olivia paused for just a moment. Then she said, the kind that reminds you where you come from so you don't forget where you're going. I felt my eyes fill with tears because she understood. In a way that had taken all of us so much longer to learn. Rachel stood beside me, quiet, watching. That's her, isn't it? She whispered. Yes, I said. She sounds so sure. She is, I replied. Rachel nodded slowly. I wish I had felt that way at her age. I looked at her. You do now. She smiled faintly. I'm getting there. Our relationship didn't magically fix itself overnight. That's not how real life works. But something had changed. Not in words, in actions. Rachel started visiting more often. Not for discussions, not for decisions, just to be there. Sometimes she brought dinner. Sometimes she brought nothing at all. And sometimes we sat on the porch in silence, just watching the world move around us the way it always had. Jason came too, less frequently at first, but when he did, he didn't talk about investments or numbers. He asked questions about the house, about its history, about the choices Thomas had made, and slowly even he began to see it differently. Not just as an asset, but as something worth preserving. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air carried that familiar quiet of early fall, Rachel turned to me. I used to think success meant leaving all of this behind, she said. I smiled slightly. And now? She looked out at the yard, her expression calm. Now I think success means understanding what you were given and choosing what to keep. I nodded. That's a very good definition. She laughed softly. I had a good teacher. I raised an eyebrow. Was it me? She shook her head, smiling. Dad, she said, you just helped me finally listen. That stayed with me, because it was true. This wasn't just my decision. It wasn't just Rachel's realization. It was something Thomas had started long before any of us understood it. He had protected this house quietly, patiently, without needing recognition. And in doing so, he had protected something inside all of us. As the months passed, the house settled into its new role. Still ours, still home. But also something more. Something that carried our story forward. Not just for us, but for anyone who walked through its doors and took the time to listen. One afternoon, I stood alone in the living room, looking at the photographs Olivia had arranged months ago. Rachel at 5, at 8, at 13, Thomas beside her, beside me, always present. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the frame. You were right, I whispered. Not about the money, not about the house itself, but about something much more important. That value. Real value could never be measured in numbers. It could only be understood in moments, in memories. In the quiet, steady way something continues to matter, long after the world has tried to assign it a price. And as I stood there, surrounded by everything this house had given me, I realized something that brought me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I hadn't just kept the house. I had kept what it stood for. And that was worth more than anything anyone could have offered. Before you go, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. Have you ever been made to feel like where you came from wasn't good enough? Like the home that raised you, the memories that shaped you, or the life that built you, somehow became something to hide? Because I think more people know that feeling than we admit. So tell me honestly in the comments, if you were in my place, would you have sold the house for millions, or would you have fought to keep it no matter what? I truly want to know what you would have chosen. Because there's no easy answer when money and memory stand on opposite sides of the same door. And if there's a place in your life that still lives in your heart, a childhood home, a front porch, a kitchen table, a room full of memories, I'd love for you to share that too. Sometimes the stories we carry are worth more than anything the world could ever offer us. Also tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. It always means so much to see how far these stories travel and how many hearts they reach. If this story touched you, stayed with you, or reminded you of something you thought you'd forgotten, please like this video and subscribe. Not just to support the channel, but so we can keep sharing stories that speak to the parts of us the world often tells us to outgrow. And remember this, never let anyone make you ashamed of where you started, because sometimes the very thing the world looks down on turns out to be the most valuable part of who you are.